Bardzo dziękuję. Pozwolę sobie zgodnie z zapowiedzią i zgodnie z planem wygłosić swój referat po angielsku. So, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to talk about organizing prints collections in the 16th century by discussing the case of Jan Ponętowski, who created one of the very few late 16th century prints collections that has actually survived. Ponętowski was an abbot at the Hradisko monastery near Olomouc from 1577 to 1587. During that time, he acquired many library and art items, which he took to Krakow, where he returned around 1588. He donated many of these items in 1592 to the University of Krakow. Some of them, including the print collection, still adorn the Jagiellonian Library. Most of his prints were bound in albums. The slide shows 7 out of 12 preserved albums. They offer a rare opportunity to reconstruct and observe the process of creating print albums in the late 16th century. So we can see how print albums were made and organized, and whether any principles were applied to their arrangement. I will discuss those questions using the example of one album, Typus Ecclesiae Catholicae, about in 1582. That album consists of 78 prints with gilded edges. The album is bound in brown tan skin with modest but elegant gold-tooled decoration and Ponętowski's supralibros. The title, Typus Ecclesiae Catholicae, and the date of binding are also gold-tooled on the front cover. The volume underwent conservation treatment at some point. The covers, as you can see on the slide, were obviously repaired, especially on the spine. The spine was also probably reinforced using extra glue, the excess of which is still visible. However, the spine is still held together by scraps of parchment manuscript waste. The conservation does not seem to have affected the sequence of prints presented here today. The stages of organizing prints for Ponętowski's album may be reconstructed by evaluating 2 sets of numbers, which I will describe in detail. The first set consists of numbers written in ink on only 10 sheets. These numbers were placed in the middle bottom section of the print. The numbers were written prior to the binding and before the album pages were cut to form a nice sharp edge of the book block ready for edge gilding. There were probably more numbers, but most were written low enough to be cut away. As we can see, 25 was cut in half. The numbers preserved were either written too high to be cut off, or they were written on smaller pages that had to be supplemented with margin strip to fit the format of the album. Some of these strips, as you can see here on the right, were glued onto the versa of the print, leaving the number visible on the recto, like in this case of 39. And you can see another close-up on the other side on the left here with 39. Some of these strips, however, were glued onto the recto, like here, onto the recto of the print, covering the number that appears only when viewed by transmitted light. And you can see here the number 30, covered by the margin strip. 2 of the margin strips have fragments of watermark dated circa 1581. The paper was produced in Sztumpek, a town 50 kilometers from Olomouc, where Ponętowski resided in 1580s. Paper from the same paper mill was used by the bookbinders who bound Ponętowski's books. These margins and numbers clearly date back to the late 16th century and belong to Ponętowski's original albums. The numbers written in ink shed light on the very early stage of creating the album, when the prints were assembled by the collector who tried to organize them. We can even imagine a collector or a person hired by him who organized the collection of single-leaf prints and who recorded their order by noting small numbers on the middle bottom edge of the sheet. Since this was a preliminary stage, it is not surprising that the final sequence in the album is very close to the one recorded in the inked numbers, but does not follow them precisely. I bolded on the slide the numbers that are in the correct places in relation to each other. So even though the sequence was augmented after writing those numbers, it was not rearranged or completely altered. They are still continuous. Prior to binding the album, the pile of numbered sheets had to be transformed into quires. Therefore, a second set of numbers was introduced. They served as quire signatures that facilitated the arrangement for the bookbinder. These numbers from 1 to 6, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, were written in metal point and were repeated throughout the album in the bottom right corner of the prints. This numbering set is also incomplete. It was also introduced before the edges were cut and gilded, as this example of halved 6 with the gilded edge testifies. Probably more numbers were cut off this way. Importantly, the final sequence of the album follows these numbers quite precisely, which can be seen in the example of this unique quire where all the numbers are preserved. There are some situations, however, when this numbering does not follow the sequence. For example, when a print went missing, as in this sequence visible on the slide, the first print of the quire was removed at some point after the binding was done, leaving the irregular stub, and then only those narrow remnants of the missing print remain, and the subsequent numbers recall its previous existence. So we have here number 2, 3, and the last one is 6, and this would be the number 1. The first print in the quire would be the number 1. If last-minute amendments were introduced, the sequence was also altered. This quire was supposed to have 6 prints. We see that the last print has a number 6, and it was obviously numbered as such. Just before final binding, the print with the inventory number 1956, a gray one here, was easily sewn in the middle of the quire, and the 1958, also gray one here, was glued to the print that was already in the sequence. Without them, the print 1960 would be the 6th sheet in the quire. Since all of the sheets in the quire have gilded edges, these amendments were last-minute decisions made in the 16th century. So one may ask, what was the rationale for these additions? This quire is preceded by several images depicting Virgin Mary with child, like this one. The quire starts with allegorical depiction of the fragile human nature that was adopted by Jesus Christ, who is mentioned on this print explicitly. Subsequent images depict the starting point for the earthly ministry of Jesus, so his baptism, and the very end of his life as a human, so his passion. The first last-minute addition was Ecce Homo, placed after Last Supper, but before flagellation. Its inclusion disrupts the chronology, but corresponds with the depiction of human nature, as if creating a closing frame. Here, instead of a child, we see Christ's tormented body. The second addition is elaborate depiction of crucifixion. This addition is as much thematic as it is iconographic, because it opens a whole set of crucifixions, also allegorical ones. Sequences built around the theme or visual correspondence stemming from iconographical similarities are typical for Ponętowski's album. Typus Ecclesiae Catholicae as an album opens with depictions of representatives of Christ and the Catholic Church, the Pope, cardinals, and many allegorical depictions, including the most important one, Typus Ecclesiae Catholicae, so the image of Catholic Church, which was used as the album's title. And you can see on the slide a selection from this opening group of the album. This is followed by prints alluding to the role of Christ and the Virgin in the history of salvation. Some of these prints we have already seen. Another grouping includes saints and Catholic rulers, or at least allusions to them. The album concludes with very few vanitative depictions that probably included two designs for Ponętowski's tomb. One might assume that Ponętowski saw himself in this complex image of the Catholic Church as illustrated by the prints in this album. The title of the album was not a mere repetition of a title of the allegorical print. It encapsulates all the prints included in the album, as if it was a book. Ponętowski's attitude towards organizing prints resembles the words from Samuel Kiszlebeck's treatise on museums from 1565, where he described the creation of print collection. As all the most perceptive and wise are accustomed to do, collectors leave unbound those pieces that are printed individually on large pages in their own groups. And so only those who have no intention of further increasing their collection are content to classify them once and for all according to distant classes. Bind them
Pytał jeszcze przeprowadzić głos, tak?
And store them among the rest. This enables us to place Ponętowski, our Moravian abbot, among the most perceptive and wise collectors. His struggles to establish the sequence show that creating a print album was an ongoing process that he probably found difficult to finish. Typus Ecclesiae Catholicae was constantly augmented before it was bound once and for all between the album's covers. Examples from other albums show that Ponętowski sometimes added extra prints after the album was bound. Even if the sequence was initially established, the urge to complete it with yet another suitable amendment was too strong. Some sequence choices may be difficult for us to understand without a commentary, but it is clear that most of them were carefully thought out. Organizing print albums was an intellectual exercise performed on thousands of images. Albums reflect a visual narration uttered by a compiler who undertook this painstaking endeavor of dealing with the late 16th century deluge of graphic works, which was only going to escalate in the next century. Thank you very much.